wonderful opportunity that this particular competition presents, which is for translators with so many languages and very interesting criteria and tests and details, which I'm going to walk you through in the next 1 hour. So my name is András Baneth, and I'm broadcasting this live from the brand new Ambioric studio. I don't know how it's visible behind me, which is at our event space in Brussels. And we are very happy to have this space and be able to provide all the information that I believe will be helpful for your exam, for your competition in a nice professional setting. So with that, let's get started. As always, you are very welcome to put questions into the chat box. Depending on the number of questions, I may not be able to answer all of them. If that is the case, we'll find a way to follow up and put out some communication or information that will give you all the answers that we're able to answer. And also, it reminds me to underline that we are a private company. We are not the European Personnel Selection Office. We are not EPSO. So everything I say is to the best of our knowledge, and we did a lot of effort to make sure that everything is accurate and everything is up to speed, but we're not the official representative when it comes to the exams. Everything is in officially from the notice of competition and other forms of communication that you will receive. But of course, we're trying to be as helpful as we can. And we have roughly 15 years by now, 15 years experience dealing with European careers. So we'll do our best to provide context and background. So with that, why don't we get started? I will not bore you with my background. Some of you might know my work with EU training, with the Ultimate EU Textbook, and I'm involved in other projects as well. One of them is the studio. And if you are in Brussels, you're very welcome to come by and check it out if you're interested in recording anything. But with that, let's look at the translator competition, because it's an amazing opportunity given the number and the relatively flexible criteria that EPSO and the selection board has put out. And many of you, most of you, will find it pretty open, perhaps even more open than used to be the case, that you will be eligible for it and you have a great realistic chance of succeeding. So with that, the number of positions are listed in the notice of competition, positions in the reserve list. So these are not specific jobs which are currently vacant and need to be filled in, but these are the numbers that are reserved on the reserve list. That's how many candidates they are seeking to place on the reserve list per linguistic profile. So we have Danish, Greek, English, Spanish, French, Italian, Maltese, and Dutch. So all of these languages have somewhat different numbers, how many translators the EU institutions are seeking to hire afterwards. But as we always say, this is the selection process. We're not looking at the recruitment part. Those of you who are new to the field would need to understand that selection is what we're looking at. And once you are on the reserve list, that's when you become recruitable into a specific position in one of the EU institutions. And there are many EU institutions, even more bodies in legal terms. That's a separate thing. But there are 7 EU institutions and even more, which are clients of the European Personnel Selection Office, and those who can take candidates and hire candidates from those reserve lists. So there are quite a lot of opportunities in the end, and this is not constrained to one institution or another. Where the place of work will be largely depends on which institution hires you in the end. This is not something that you can know at this stage. So you will not know upfront that you will end up in Luxembourg or in Brussels, though chances are these are the 2 cities where the Commission, where the Parliament, where the Court of Auditors, where the Court of Justice, and other institutions and bodies which constitute the board and the clients, so to say, of the European Personnel Selection Office. That's where they are based. But even theoretically, other places of work could be imagined depending on where a given institution or body operates inside or outside the EU. But in this case, it's essentially Brussels and Luxembourg where you can realistically expect to work. And Strasbourg, officially, that's where the Ombudsman and the European Parliament's seat is. But that's a very small fraction of the opportunities in the end. So that is really, as a a minor point. So with that, what is it that you are expected to do when you are hired as a translator? So what is the job that ultimately will be offered as a result of the selection procedure we are covering today? That is everything you see on screen. So translation, obviously, a lot of tools and IT tools are increasingly important in this particular line of work. And it also includes proofreading. It also includes linguistic editing, localization. And there's a very interesting, important, say, sociological or cultural aspect around a given language. And that is something we'll come back to for a second, because this is an integral part of any translator, is not just to do a verbatim or some sophisticated way of converting a text from language A to language B, but it has this cultural aspect to make sure that it resonates and it reads as natively written by those who speak that particular target language fluently and as natives. Now, yes, the slides will be absolutely shared in the end, and the recording as well. And then in the end, we even offer a short-term discount for those of you who are committed enough to stay all the way until the end. So we're very happy to share that in the very end of the presentation. And I will stop from time to time to answer questions, which I see are already coming in from many of you. And I'll answer a few of them and then perhaps even more in the end. So with that, are you eligible? Now, eligibility essentially has different blocks, different parts. One is the most straightforward, which are the objective criteria, whether you meet them or not. It's a yes/no question. Do you have an EU citizenship? Because if you do not, then you will not be eligible to apply for any EU job or even participate in a selection competition. Number two, that you have fulfilled the military service, if that is a requirement in your particular country of citizenship, which may be different from your country of residence, of course, but in the country of citizenship, that needs to have been fulfilled if that is a requirement for you. And the third one is that you meet the character requirements for the job. And that is especially an important point for sensitive or working with classified documents, etc. But that is a generic term that is used for every competition. So that is pretty straightforward. What is, let's say, more unique, more specific to each and every selection procedure and specific competition are the ones that we're going to cover now, the more specific requirements. Language, so what languages you need to speak. And of course, we're talking about translator exams where language is vital. And then the qualifications and work experience. And that is what I hinted at early on, because these criteria are pretty flexible. And that really opens up this opportunity for a lot of candidates. So you need not have to have any formal education in translation science or linguistic science or any similar field. It's far more open than that. So we're going to get to that in short order. Before that, as you have probably already started playing with the application, with the profile, with the whole system that is required to be filled out, well, there is a tool called EASY, of course, play on word, where it's an experience assessment survey instrument, hence the abbreviation EASY, which is used without any particular consequence, but it's a tool where EPSO, the Personal Selection Office, they really want to weed out and make sure that those who are manifestly ineligible because they don't have EU citizenship, because they don't have even the basic qualification that might be required. So those who are absolutely not supposed to apply and take up administrative bandwidth and also just be frustrated for having been rejected. So on both sides, on the institutions and the candidate side, they really would like to make sure that those are clear to the candidates that they would not qualify to be part of this competition. Hence the tool. That is what it does, where you fill in a couple of questions, but it's, again, not a formal part of the application process. It is something for you to be sure that you meet the basic requirements that are prescribed. Language rules. Language rules are straightforward, as we are going to walk through that, but still you need to pay a lot of attention to it to make sure that you get it right. So there are 3 languages in this particular competition. And I'll just give you as a footnote a bit of context, because there have been a lot of court cases, court meaning European Court of Justice or the general court cases, that dealt with the linguistic regime around selection exams, selection competitions, because occasionally there were competitions where the linguistic choice was rather limited. And that was challenged by some member states, saying, well, that hurts, it's a discrimination against certain languages, or it's a violation of the treaty, that it doesn't respect the democratic nature of the EU and the equality of the languages. So language is always a very tricky thing, legally speaking, but for you as candidates, potential candidates, the language part is essential because it has a big impact on the exams and a big impact on how you are advised to prepare for these exams. And I'll tell you in a second what I mean by that. The first one is language 1. So you have language 1, which essentially native speaker level. Now, that is a level at which you need to speak the language, but you don't need any formal paper or other document to say, well, that's my mother tongue, or I really speak that well. The most important idea here is it's disconnected, decoupled from your citizenship. You can be a citizen, say you're a Czech citizen, but the language that you speak on native level could be English, it could be Spanish, it could be Lithuanian. Any language would qualify, provided you do speak it and master it to that degree. So it has nothing to do with your formal citizenship. Language 2 must be English or French. So that is an essential point. It's either English or French, because that is typically the source language from which you need to translate into language 1. So we need to speak about language 3. So, and I'm looking at the screen just to make sure I give you the accurate, right information. So that could, again, be any of the EU's 24 official languages, but it's practically not 24 anymore, because language 1 is any, well, language is the chosen profile, right? Like, let's suppose you're sitting the Dutch competition. So you are applying to be a Dutch translator. So first language will be Dutch. Second language, English or French. And the third language will be any of the remaining 22 languages. So it's theoretically 24, but practically speaking, it's you're left with 22 languages. And of course, no language from these 3 can be the same. So for language 1, if that is English, then language 2 will need to be French. And then language 3 can be Maltese or Swedish or any other language. So that is the linguistic rule. And that requires maybe some thinking, especially when it comes to language 3. Suppose you master English to that degree, that you're really confident that the level at which you can write, you can express yourself is native level. Maybe you studied there, or maybe you just really are gifted linguistic talent. The language 2 would be French, and the language 3, well, that could be any other. Now, the reason why I emphasize this point is that it has an impact on the language that will be required for a given exam in the framework of this particular competition. So each exam, as we're going to look at in a moment, has a predetermined language, which is either language 1, either language 2, or either language 3. So depending on which languages you pick, that will determine the language in which you need to take a particular exam, which essentially you need to pass to be able to be placed on the reserve list to succeed. So there are certain exceptions, right? So when for the English one, there's an exception. So having covered all of what I've covered, so the language of your chosen profile will be the language 1. And I'm looking at it just to be sure I'm accurate. And language 2 would be other than English, right? Any official language would be other than English. So I think this is actually different from my previous random example. I shouldn't have picked English. I picked the wrong fight. So what I just said 3 minutes ago as a random spontaneous example, here's the exception to that. So probably that's a better way of making sure that I'm not confusing anyone here. And then language 3 will be basically any other, as long as it's different from language 1 and 2. So the English is a bit particular if that's the language that you're picking, because then essentially you are free to choose any of the remaining 23 and then free to choose any of the remaining 22, which again opens up great opportunities because you don't need to be, let's say, speaking a particular language of this large competition if you are really good and confident in English. But again, it has to be pretty much native level. So in that case, you can try yourself even if your particular mother tongue is not listed in there, right? Now, okay, just 1 second. Moving on. And then with French, it's essentially the language of your chosen profile, right? Which is, in this case, French. In this case, it's French. And then the language 2 will be English, right? So French, English is a particular combination, and then language 3 will be any of the official languages. Okay, so I hope that's clear. And I pause here for a second because I see that there are a couple of questions coming in. So why don't I answer those to be sure that everybody is on the same page? Okay, so randomly picking a few. For French, 180 people on the reserve list, but how many people do you need? Well, you is not me. You being EU institutions, which we don't represent. Now, they meaning those who are in charge of this competition, would always do a preliminary conversation, more than a conversation, but planning with the institutions to evaluate how many candidates they actually need. And more than candidates, how many staff, how many places they want to fill in. So that number is not a random number, but there's no guarantee that all 180 people who are on the reserve list will be eventually hired. And there's also some practical reason to that, because some people's situation might change in the meantime. They might change their mind, or a lot of variables out there. But again, it's costly to do a competition of this kind, and they don't do it for the fun of it. So there is a specific planning. Now, what the conversion rate, to use that marketing term, is between those on the reserve list and those hired in the end, that is something we need to see. And it is definitely lower than the 180, but to what degree lower is to be seen as we get there. Okay, here's another one. Can we use translation tools during the translation or revision? To the best of my knowledge, no. At least there's no communication about it at this point, even though in the job itself, there are obviously access to a lot of tools, but at the exam itself, there has been zero indication that any tool could be used. And my, let's say, informed guess is that this is not going to change. So I would think that you're not going to be given any external tool to use during translation. But again, I say that as a big caveat, that we need to see if there's any further communication until the time of the exam, whether they might change the policy on that. When is the test day expected to be? Well, that is, again, quite a bit of uncertainty, but recently, in the past few months, a lot of exams have been announced, and EPSO is kind of working with their backlog and trying to catch up and make the exams more dynamic, in the sense that they happen faster. So the guess, I would say, sometime in the spring, whether that's February, whether that's April. Well, we'll see. The deadline to hand in your degree, your diploma, is in April. So probably March, April is more likely for the tests. But again, I say that caveat, and it's an estimate, but at least it gives you a rough idea of when. But usually 4 to 6 weeks before, you will know when the exam day is. So a month and a half in advance, you will know when the exam day is. It's not that from one day to the next or 1 week to the next. All right. All the eligible profiles will be invited to sit the test. And yes, so as long as you meet the formal criteria, then you are guaranteed to be invited to sit the test. The way they evaluate, score the tests, as we'll walk through in a moment, it varies on the results of one element or another, but that is not something happening live when you are sitting the exam. It's not that you go in on exam day, you do 2 or 3 tests, the results are not great, and you can't even do the rest. That's not the case. The case is you need to sit through all the tests that you are given for the exam, and as they later do the scoring, some of it done by computers, some of it done by humans, especially the translation evaluation is going to be done by humans. That is what's going to determine whether you qualify for the reserve list in the end. All right, 1 or 2 more, and then we go on. If you are offered a contract in Luxembourg and you refuse it because you're in Belgium and family, are you penalized somehow? You're not penalized. It's more of a dilemma, but you don't get any, I don't know, black points or a little asterisk next to your name, but you may not be offered quickly another opportunity elsewhere. So there's a bit of calculation there whether or not you would take that and whether there are other opportunities, but some candidates may have more than one opportunity. So let's say it doesn't fall back on you in those kind of administrative terms. It's more about the opportunity, whether you want to take it. And you may as well negotiate teleworking some days or some flexibility, but that's a separate conversation. All right, maybe one more and then we go on. Are there quotas of languages 2 and 3 for each language 1? I'm not sure I get what you mean. So maybe you want to rephrase that and we'll try to follow up. Back to the slides and back to the content. So the qualifications, this is what I meant earlier, where the qualifications are very broad. So this particular competition, it's a great opportunity for those who are interested in linguistics and interested in translation, but it's definitely not limited to those who studied languages. As long as you have the right skills and you pass the competition and you meet the criteria, you can be an astrophysicist and you can be really a mechanical engineer, or you can be a master in healthcare for that matter. As long as you meet the other criteria, it's very open. So no professional experience is required. That's another alleviation of the criteria, because often they would require 3 years or 6 years or a certain number of years relevant work experience. But in this case, there's no professional experience required. So this is an 85 level competition. That means entry level for administrators. So those who have a degree, and that is the only criteria that they basically put together. So that is very open, and that's why I would encourage everyone to give it a try, provided you meet the criteria, provided you feel that you can pass the different components of the exam. But it doesn't limit anyone who may not have the right profile, because here any profile is the right profile provided those conditions are met. All right, why it's a great opportunity. Many of you would certainly need zero convincing that this is a great opportunity. Some of you may be already working as contract agents or temporary agents in the institutions, while others are new to the field. So there are great benefits with health insurance, with European schools, with other added benefits. There is a salary calculator on our website on EU Training. So if you want to check based on your situation, where you might be hired from, whether you have children or not, these factors have an impact on the salary that you would be given. So we did a rough simulation with salary step 1, so with no work experience basically, and we said, well, eligible household allowance. So that essentially refers to you being married or having kids. So that also has an impact. But we said no, and the net salary is roughly this. Again, with some disclaimers, that is not necessarily the exact amount of money, but it gives you a range. It gives you an idea of what to expect. Now, let's look at the different competition phases. I'll take a quick look at the other questions that may have come in since. What's different from the permanent CAST exams for translators? Well, two main differences there. So those of you who are new to the field, so CAST is the contract agent selection tests, which aim for contract agent positions. So that's a fixed term contract, whereas this is for a permanent contract. You will have a status which is open-ended. It doesn't expire at any point. So that is a major difference. And another one is that for the CAST exam, the contract agent tests, well, there are fewer exams. So as we're going to walk through the different competition phases, you will see that here there are more components, more steps, more exams that you need to take. Whereas for those contract agent tests, now it's typically just an abstract, verbal, and numerical reasoning test. All right. And then will the use of these dictionaries be allowed? Typically, no. So typically, it's not allowed. And I again say that with the caveat that you might receive communication to the effect that you may be. But so far, the experience has been that dictionaries were not allowed. I'm guessing also because that would need to be an electronic dictionary, because otherwise that would go against the principle that you cannot take anything into the room where you are sitting the exam on the exam day, which, by the way, has to be your responsibility. There are no exam centers anymore. And then as a footnote, here at the Ambiorix Center where we are, we offer exam spaces. We have 4 spaces where we guarantee all the right stuff to be installed for you. So if that's of interest when the exam day comes, get in touch, and we're happy to take care of that. But going back to the dictionaries, no physical dictionary will almost certainly not be allowed. And electronic dictionary, well, I don't know if they're going to change their policy. Chances are that they won't. If I'm proven wrong, you will know that way in advance. So that is something that will be communicated to you, to everyone, if they build in some software essentially into the exam taking platform, and they say, okay, you can actually use it, or a thesaurus or spell checker or something like that. That typically has not been the case so far. We'll see how that develops, but you will definitely know it in advance. And one more, I think this is the question. No, okay, that was a question related to the dictionary, so I'll stick with that. And here's what is the difference between L3 and L2? Is one more used than the other? Well, L2, so language 2, is the one that you translate from. So essentially that will be the language from which you pick up the source material and you translate that into language 1. Whereas language 3 is more of an add-on. It's more of an additional language that you speak or that you are let's say proficient in, but that is let's say one level lower. The expectation of how proficient you are in that particular language is sort of one level lower than language 1, language 2. So that's essentially the difference. And also the way that the competition is, and which we're going to look at in a moment, there's a difference how they test those. I'll give you an example, my own personal example. Many years ago, even more than those years ago, so a long time ago, when I took the lawyer linguist exam, which is fairly comparable to the translator competition that we're talking about. So there I had 3 languages. So I'm Hungarian, so language 1 would be Hungarian. Well, there is no Hungarian in this particular exam, but that's the language into which I would be expected to translate. Language 2, maybe English, and the language 3, maybe French. So language 3 would not be expected. I would not be expected to speak, to master that language to that degree. But language 1 is really that's the target language that I need to be absolutely proficient in and write clearly, and spelling and linguistic rules and stylistic things and everything that goes with it. So that's just to give you a rough idea of language 1, 2, and 3, how they compare to each other. So application process, application submitted online, pretty straightforward. And then you upload the supporting documents directly to your EPSO account, though there is a notable footnote there, because you need to finish the application by the 14th of January. So that's essentially in a month and a week, whatever the math is, but roughly 5 weeks from now. And holidays are coming and your mind might be totally somewhere else. So be sure that you don't miss it, you don't forget it, you check what's expected to be sure that you do that on time. And the notable exception I hinted at a moment ago is the upload of the supporting documents, because the supporting documents, as in your diplomas or any other document that they might require from you, needs to be done by April, 10th of April. So there is a difference there that helps you, because maybe you need to get hold of a certain document. You may need to do some official, the homologation, whatever that word is, where conversion essentially into an EU system, because maybe you obtained a degree outside of the EU. So there could be some administrative, bureaucratic steps that you need to take. Just be sure you launch it early on, because it might take a certain amount of time. Or if you happen to be doing your studies still, well, to the extent you can get your degree, you do get your degree by that date, then you can still apply. So that's essentially the overall idea. Now, what are the components of the exams? There are essentially 5 exams components that you need to take, that you need to pass. And in most cases, not just pass, but pass with a high enough score, and even in a competitive manner, high enough compared to other candidates. So let's look at those. But before we do that, just to emphasize, everything is happening online. There are no exam centers anymore. You will be expected to have your own computer, which for most, or the vast majority of you're most likely listening to this on a computer. You're not eavesdropping outside our building and hoping that you're going to hear what I say. It's on digital devices. That's typically not an issue. What is sometimes an issue is that you need to be able to install the software on your computer to be able to take the test, and to make sure that the software runs properly and it blocks off any other external software or help or anything else, just to be sure that essentially that no one's cheating. Now, there you need administrator rights to the computer. And you may have a computer from your employer, from your work, but you don't necessarily have that level of access to be able to install the software on the computer. So that is something you might want to think about already. How are you going to take care of that, to be sure that you can install the test-taking software when the time comes? But then again, that's probably sometime in the spring, but just to flag that already. It's remotely proctored. So again, no one's sitting with you. You need to do a check with camera and everything to be sure no one's in the room. So there are certain precautions, and it's on the same day for everyone. So that's an interesting thing. It's no longer spread out across different days or time zones for that matter. It's on the same day for everyone. Certain minor accommodations could be made if you have a certain disability or some highly, let's say, documented and justifiable reasons, then that might be properly honored. But again, that needs to be communicated well in advance. So with those, well, the 5 tests, as you see on the screen, we're going to walk through each of them, and I'll say a few things about each. So the first one is pretty straightforward. Anyone who's ever dealt with EPSO competitions, EU careers, would be greatly, vastly, deeply familiar with the so-called CBT, meaning computer-based tests. So the abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests, which are very classic and standard part of every competition there is. Now, what is less standard is the scoring, because as you see, the verbal reasoning, I raised my eyebrow when I saw that. I said, "Ooh, interesting." Usually they have 20 minutes for 10 questions, and here you have 18 minutes. And there's probably good reason for that, because translators are expected to be highly competent in their verbal skills. So the verbal reasoning, they shrunk a little bit the time available. So instead of 20, now they made it 18. One very important thing, and we're going to look at the different components as we go along. An important thing about the verbal reasoning is that it's a logic test. This is not as much testing your linguistic abilities or vocabulary, though obviously that's part of it, but it's about reasoning. So it's about a thinking and a logic test, as opposed to some other components which are far more focused on the linguistic abilities and everything that goes with it. Now, how verbal reasoning are, we have tons of materials on that, articles, ebooks, free webinars, paid webinars, personal coaching, group coaching, everything under the sun. Plus, we're also coming up with a new product, which we'll announce in due course, related to the different reasoning tests to help you prepare better, help you understand those better. But that is probably going to be launched in 2 or 3 months. All of it is a science on its own with a method on its own. So to encourage you to look into the method, it's not just about, okay, I'm reading a lot, I'm pretty good at understanding what I read, I'm quick in that, that's it. So it's also a race against the clock. It's also a time pressure that is on you. Numerical reasoning, this is pretty classic. So 10 questions in 20 minutes, 2 minutes per question, where again, it's a calculation, arithmetic test with data interpretation, reasoning, estimation, calculation. One overarching piece of advice is try not to calculate everything. Whatever you can estimate or guesstimate with a high confidence, you should do that, because eventually you're going to save time with that. And then we have the abstract reasoning, everyone's favorite, and I'm here being pretty cynical. 10 questions in 20 minutes. This does require a certain amount of practice. And we know that from our many candidates and many clients, that often this is the most challenging, and especially those who are much more into the verbal part, or their brain is much more into the verbal part. And I kind of consider myself in that tribe. This is difficult. This is often, it's not impossible, and you can find the solutions, but not necessarily so fast. So here, the real challenge is against the clock and not so much against the exercise per se. And to improve your performance, this typically needs practice. That's it. Essentially, just be more comfortable with the kind of exercises that you'll be presented with, and then just your performance is definitely going to improve. Now, the scoring, it's quite straightforward. And the good news is that it's a pass-fail. So you are not measured against other candidates. You are not ranked against other candidates. The only criterion you have here is pass the verbal reasoning, at least with a pass-fail score, which is 50%, if I'm not mistaken. Same for numerical reasoning, same for abstract reasoning. They're not combined. So it's not, sometimes they do that the verbal and the numerical are combined, or numerical and abstract. That doesn't seem to be the case here. So let me correct myself. It's a full combine. Okay, that's the right way. So it's a full combination for all of them, right? So you add up the scoring, and essentially you need to have a little more than 50%. So it's not the typical 50%. You say 22 out of 40, and that's your exercise to calculate what percentage that is. And that is the pass mark for this part of the exam, right? Now, whose score is being calculated, that's a separate matter. I will not go too much into detail. We put that on the screen, and you can read it. The most important at this stage is, what are the building blocks? What is the scoring? Where do I need to focus my preparation and my energy? So that is your number one question, to say, well, if I'm not as good with the abstract reasoning, well, then I probably need to pay more attention to that. Because even if it's a mix and match and a combined pass mark, you don't want to get 0 points on something, because that means you need to perform so much better on the other two. So you need to be able to afford to lose certain points on one exam or another in order to secure your overall score. Now, a more, let's say, unique part of this particular competition are a couple of new tests, or, well, new, old, still. not something that you typically find in other competitions. So you have the language knowledge test. And the language knowledge test is done in language 1. So depending on what you've chosen for a particular competition, based on the different, the 8 linguistic profiles we're looking at right now, this exam is in language 1. You have 25 minutes, 25 questions, and the pass mark is a little over 50%. So you need to have 13 out of 25. And we expect this to be a pretty challenging, pretty difficult test, because that is where they really look at your proficiency in a particular language, aside from the translation that we're going to look at in a moment. But this we expect to be a pretty challenging test. Now, if it's in English, comparable to an Oxford proficiency or Cambridge test. I'm not so familiar these days with these formal linguistic tests, or the TOEFL, that was a big thing, perhaps still is. Or in Spanish, it might be the DALF or DELED. One is French, one is Spanish. But certainly all of you are pretty familiar, depending on your background and whether you've taken these kind of tests. And those have pretty high standards and difficult, challenging questions, because they essentially test your vocabulary, your grammar, your punctuation, expressions, idiomatic use. So it's really looking at to what degree you master these particular tests. Next one is a language comprehension test. So the previous was slightly different. This is about the comprehension, how you are able to understand essentially the text that you're reading. And there you have 25 minutes and 12 questions. So the timing is a bit lighter. It's not so much kind of a high pressure 1 minute per question environment. Here you have a little more time, and the pass mark is 6 out of 12, so 50% essentially. And here it's about reading skills, vocabulary, grammar, appropriate language use. And the important thing is, this is not predicated on understanding any other context than what's in the text itself. So that's pretty cool, because it's not a knowledge test in any sense. It's really about reading comprehension, language comprehension, to be more exact. So as you see, it's really how you are able to process the information. We are internally, we're looking at it and say, okay, how is that different from the verbal reasoning? Because verbal reasoning, as I said, is more of a logic test, and this one is the closest thing to this is reading comprehension exams or reading comprehension exams tests. And then kind of the crown jewel in this series is the translation. So of course, if you're aiming to be a translator in the EU, well, you better prove yourself. And there's a translation test where you have 60 minutes, and from language 2 to language 1. So that is where language 2 comes into play as a source language, and language 1 as the target language, the one that you master, the one that determines which profile you had applied for. And then 50% needs to be achieved, at least. That's the absolute minimum pass mark. So if you get less than that, then you are not going to proceed to the next stage. And not everyone's translation will be actually evaluated and scored, because this is determined by your score with the previous parts. But then again, at the exam day, when you're sitting through all these tests, you're not going to know this. It's not that the computer puts up a box and says, listen, you shouldn't even take the translation test because your results were just not good enough. You will need to sit through the entire thing. There's also, just for the context, for those of you who are interested to understand, some questions may be found to contain an error afterwards, and that has an impact on the ranking and on the pass scores and stuff like that. So they cannot truly afford to do that live evaluation if there are issues afterwards. So that's why everybody has to take all these tests on the exam date. But when it comes to the actual evaluation, these are the considerations that they will follow. So the last bit in this series of test exams is the revision test. So revision test, you have 30 minutes, and that is from language 2 to language 1. Okay, so language 2, language 1. And there's a pass mark, 50% again. And it's the scoring has its own logic. Again, for whom will this actually be evaluated? And you need to pass it, right? So it's a classic linguistic revision task. And we need to see how exactly they're going to present that as a multiple choice or something more dynamic. So the exact format, I'm not aware what that's going to look like in practical terms on your screen, how the revision needs to be, or maybe you need to mark certain words or expressions or other that require revision or that have a certain issue that you need to identify. So these were the components, quite a handful. So exam day is going to be busy, it's going to be tough, it's going to be mentally challenging, as long as you know what the different components are, what to expect, and to say, okay, well, for the abstract verbal numerical, that's the score I need to reach. I shouldn't be that stressed about it, but I need to be sure that I'm going to pass it. And the language comprehension one and all the others, you know also how dedicated you need to be, or how much practice you want to put into the different components, depending on where you are currently, your skills, your linguistic abilities, and the scoring that will determine whether or not you pass to the next stage. So overall scoring, these are the scoring guidelines, so to say, and the calculations. So overall, you have 152. Okay, so 152 points you can get, which is from language comprehension, translation test, and revision test, right? So that's the maximum score that you can get. And then that's when they do the eligibility check, which in this particular case is not going to make a huge difference, presumably, given that the diploma requirements and the other formal requirements are pretty flexible. As a side note, for many other competitions, that's not the case, where they might require certain specific qualifications or a certain number of work experience that you need to prove, etc. So many candidates become kind of uneligible at that point. Here, it's probably not going to make a huge difference for most cases, but of course, they need to check what you declared and what you can prove with documents. And the reason why all of this is called a concours, it's a competition, it's because there's a ranking based on the score that you ultimately reached. So the ranking doesn't happen for the particular exams as such. The ranking happens overall based on the aggregate number that I presented. And then there is a ranking of the candidates until the number of candidates are reached that had been communicated up front, the one that we started the presentation with. And then you are ready and available to be hired by any institution that can pick you from the reserve list. There are certain things you can proactively do. We have a webinar on that. It's called How to Get a Job Once You're on the Reserve List. So there are certain tricks and ideas that I share with you. It's on our website. And when you get there, we can talk about that part. For now, focus on getting on the reserve list. That's the number one goal. Voila, how to get the job. And then we'll look at the many questions that have since come in. A couple of tips, whether it's practicing for quite a few weeks. Again, don't take it very lightly, given the sheer number of candidates that are interested in the competition. Depending on the languages, so maybe the Greek one will be more popular than some other language. That is anyone's guess, but still take it seriously, because there are many components. You need to understand the methodology. You need to perform well so that the objective pass marks, which we saw roughly 50%, 60% of the overall score, that is the minimum basically for every component. But also there's a ranking. So it's at the end of the day, you don't need to pass just by going above the pass mark. You need to pass with pretty good scores so that you will perform well in the ranking. And then whether it's 1 hour a day, 10 hours a week, it's really where you are, where you want to get to, creating a proper plan and a proper methodology, and being persistent and really doing the simulations whether with a peer group, with a friend, with you check each other's translations, or you motivate each other. There are many ways, and we have a lot of practice tests, so you're welcome to check those out. We have verbal reasoning in literally every EU official, in each and every official language, so all 24, really from Latvian to Portuguese to what have you. That is something that can help for the abstract verbal numerical. And also we have language comprehension tests. So we're making sure that that's going to be available for all the languages of the competition. We have almost all languages covered already now, but one or two may need to be added. And the language knowledge practice tests, those are coming soon. So that is something we are already looking at and working on and developing with experts and the right people. So we can offer that for you by the time the exam is announced, perhaps even sooner, to be sure that you can be fully up to speed and practice for those. And CBT, the computer-based tests, so abstract verbal numerical reasoning, webinars, lots of free ones, a couple of paid ones. And as I said, we offer courses and we have coaches and trainers and a great team who can help you, and lots of other tips about everything else that I mentioned. One is perhaps of interest. There's a preparation planner tool that's a completely free tool. Basically, it's fairly basic at this point. We're looking at how to refine it, but already in its current stage, I think it's helpful, and we got positive feedback from many candidates, where you can basically feed in when your exam is, which we don't know for now, but assume it's in 2 or 3 months, and then where your challenges, say weaknesses, currently are among the different components, and it gives you a proper plan based on how much time you have available to prepare per day or per week. So again, it gives you a roadmap for preparation, and there are community groups on Facebook and also on our own platform that you might want to check out. There's the book, the Ultimate EU Test Book, if you prefer a physical source or a physical book to help with your preparation. And I also did and will do again an exam. I'm not doing an exam. I'm helping others who take the exam to help you create a plan for the exam. Basically, a preparation mastery where we talk about concrete steps that you can take to prepare for a certain competition and to see partly the mindset part of it, what you may want to address if you are procrastinating, if you are afraid of the exam day, if you stress out, all the way to creating a proper way that you regularly practice and you are not leaving it for the last moment and may not succeed. And then I leave the discount code on the page, and I address a couple of questions in the next 7 or so minutes in respect of everyone's time. So here's one. Can you get a moving allowance even if you don't move in the exact city, but a city nearby? Oh, okay. That refers to the recruitment part, where you are actually hired. Once you're on the reserve list, you are hired and you get a certain allowance for moving. And whether you qualify if you don't move to Brussels maybe or elsewhere, it largely depends on, well, you need to be close enough, so to say, to be able to take up a given job. It largely depends on where you are moving from and whether that's in a certain radius from the place of work. I forget, maybe 500 kilometers or something. If it's more than that, then you get certain allowance. All right. Are you allowed to be hired via EPSO or to work as a freelancer in parallel? Well, EPSO is the personal selection office. They do the selection and they run the exams and everything that goes with it. Or practically, legally speaking, it's the selection board that does it under the umbrella of EPSO. But the actual hiring is done by the institutions. And once you're hired, you become an EU official. So you are subject to the statute and the laws that govern the situation and law, let's say, obligations and rights of EU officials. And according to that, there are pretty strict rules of what you can or cannot do, but you certainly are not going to be allowed to work as a freelancer in parallel to being an EU official translator. All right, other question. If bilingual, it's better to use French as first or second language? Well, yeah, so if you are in that, well, lucky, say fortunate situation that you're bilingual, and I take that you might be, well, wouldn't take that English is your other language, but if you're bilingual and you want to pick French as first language, I would say the determining factor, if you have that flexibility to choose from multiple languages, is in which language can you write best? Because you need to do the translation into language one. And if you're not that comfortable writing in French, because French is a difficult language, as we all know, and a lot of accents and a lot of different conjugations and all that, you might be more prone to error unless you're really confident in your ability, whether you're native, whether you studied it. Anyways, if you're comfortable expressing yourself in writing in French, then you may choose it as language one. But if you're a little hesitant, my French is pretty fluent, but writing in French, oof, that's still, I do errors and I do need spell check. So I would not choose French as my language one. English would be my choice, but again, that's my personal preference because of the reasons I just said. So these are the considerations I would advise you to bear in mind and then decide accordingly, because in language one is where you need to be really good, not just in clicking A, B, C, D, whatever, in a multiple choice quiz. That's the language in which you need to write, actively write and type out those words and sentences. All right. Could you please let us know if we need to provide certificates for language 1 and 2? And the answer is no, you are not required to give any certificate whatsoever. That is what the exams are for. So the exams are effectively testing your linguistic proficiency, and they do not require you to provide any official document or diploma or what have you in any of those languages. When is the reserve list expected to be published? Well, I can answer the question once we know when the exam itself is. Well, even then I cannot really answer it. But what I can tell you is the ambition of EPSO is generally to have 6 months from the date of announcement of the competition until the reserve list is out. Now, if you do the math, it's just been published. So basically what would be this? January, February, March, April, May, right? So by early May, if there's a reserve list, that's the ambitious plan. Reality might be a little more complicated, but I'd say hopefully by the summer, the reserve list has a realistic chance of being published. So at least there is an ambition in organizational administrative terms to push these new competitions to the degree that's possible. What kind of translations are used in the exam? General, specialized? Well, since the candidate pool is very broad, it's very wide, it's not going to be super specialized, but my guess would be that it's some EU-related text. It's not about, I don't know, neuroscience research, or perhaps about that, but the EU angle of that, and not just as such on running whatever experiments. So framed around the EU, it could be a more specific, as it could be about really border control all the way to free trade negotiations, pretty broad. But this is not a lawyer linguist competition where it's court judgment and legal text, and this is not for medical translators. It's translators in a very broad sense. So that's what I can say about it right now. And of course, we're monitoring trends and rumors and all that. So if we have more information, then we'll be sure to let you know. How long are the texts for the language comprehension test? Language comprehension test, that's, I cannot say something with a high degree of confidence, because even if there were similar exams in the past, this is somewhat new. Our estimate would be anything between 5 to 8 lines, say roughly 1 or 2 paragraphs, but longer ones. But it's something we're also analyzing right now to see, okay, given the time available, what is realistic to serve as the underlying text that they can ask questions about. So again, it's not going to be 1-page documents per question, that you need to super quickly speed read and get there. Is machine translation allowed? Well, not in the exam, because then why would you be there unless you do a machine translation and then you refine certain points and improve the text. So that goes back to my earlier comment on whether dictionaries or electronic dictionaries would be allowed, where I said my guess is most likely no, unless we hear otherwise, but that's going to be formally disclosed to everyone. So to this question, I would say no, machine translations are almost certainly not going to be allowed. Do they take into account additional qualifications or professional experience? No, not for the purposes of the selection exam. Those can come in handy when you get to the actual recruitment bit. So once you are on the reserve list and you're looking for a job, those certificates and those extra work experiences, well, those could come in very handy, because then the head of unit or whoever is the person ultimately hiring you, well, they can say, okay, that experience seems pretty relevant or helpful for us, and it's an additional asset for to consider for your hiring. Okay, one or two final, and then we close it off, which is, will the job be remote? Well, it's not going to be fully remote, but there could be elements where teleworking is allowed on a certain number of days. So there's a bit of flexibility given the nature of the job of a translator. And that also partly depends on the Directorate General or the different institution of what their general policy on these matters is. Okay, and then the final bit, I just very randomly pick one. Should English natives pick a rare language for our language 2, or should we stick to a common one like German? Well, I'd say the first consideration is how well do you speak that particular language? Are you confident that you can pass the exam in a particular language? So first, your first focus is passing the exam. Focus number 2 is getting a job. And for getting a job, it's definitely helpful to have a lesser spoken language than a large language, so to say. So that can demonstrate that, okay, you're available for those where not many candidates are likely to be your effective competitors. But if you don't pass the exam, well, that's not going to serve you ultimately. So that's the consideration I would look at. As long as you are confident that you can pass the exam in that language, then you definitely could consider it as a choice. Voila, I see there are a couple other languages there. Languages, you see, I'm so much into languages. A couple other questions there, but we'll find a way to follow up on those. I thank you profoundly for your time, for your attention. A huge thanks goes to Rita, to Jofi, to David, and everyone who worked on the slides, the presentation, and everything else. Thank you so much for being here, for being part of this. And if you have any questions, send us through the contact form or through email. Very happy to answer those. And as I said, there were a couple of open points where I was very transparent to tell you what I know and what I don't know. We are monitoring the developments. We're looking at the information that's coming officially and sometimes through the grapevine. And that is helpful for the candidates like yourselves. And we're providing all the tools we can to help your preparation, help your test methodology, and all the rest. So please stay in touch. We're happy to help in any way we can. And wishing you good luck. This is a wonderful opportunity for a lot of you linguistically minded, or those who may not have yet considered that career path, but still this is a way into the institution, and that could be helpful in the long term. So thank you very much for being here, and conversation to be continued.